This video is brought to you by Squarespace. This is the most unlucky ship ever built. Designed to be the largest paddle steamer ever made, it would actually be the biggest ship for over 40 years, able to travel from London to the new colony of Sydney, Australia without stopping or refueling, with over 4,000 passengers in unparalleled luxury aboard a floating city. It would be dubbed the Crystal Palace of the Sea. But in reality, it would be a total disaster. Building such a huge ship would be nearly impossible, and launching it to the sea would prove so taxing that it would be the single heaviest object moved by humans to that point. And the sheer cost would bankrupt the company and all of its investors 4 times in a row, the stress of which would kill the designer in the end. And when it finally did set sail, it was so unpopular, horrible to sail aboard, and expensive that it actually caused riots and sunk 10 other ships. And yes, there is quite a death toll attached as well. This is the story of a megalomaniac's fever dream, the bad luck Leviathan of the seas, the SS Great Eastern. Isambard Kingdom Brunel was a master of steam. He had conquered the transatlantic travel between North America with his twin ships, the Great Western and the Great Britain, and thought, why would he settle for one continent when there were others for the taking, like Australia, Asia and Africa? So in a fit of passion, he created a new super steam paddle, capable of making far longer voyages, such as to Australia, non-stop, with a capacity of 15,000 tons of coal, 4,000 passengers, 500 crew, and carry 13,000 tons of cargo. Not only would a ship of this scale be impossibly huge for the time, it would also be 6 times faster than the nearest other vessel. And if it was built, it would effectively monopolize trade with Asia and Great Britain. And it made sense too, the sheer size would lead to huge economies of scale. It would be faster than other ships, cargo would cost far less to transport, and the operating cost of the crew would be minuscule. Brunel recognized that his massive ship would need more than one propulsion system to be effective. At the time, twin screws were still largely experimental, so he opted for a hybrid approach, a single screw propeller combined with paddle wheels and auxiliary sails, to get it up to 14 knots or around 16 miles per hour. Although he had already introduced the screw propeller on a large scale with the Great Britain ship, Brunel doubted that a single propeller or paddle shaft could deliver the immense power needed to propel such a colossal vessel at the desired speed. With the 20,000 ton displacement design finalized, Brunel would take it to the board of the Eastern Steam Navigation Company, and with their stamp of approval, got to work. And almost immediately, everything went wrong. To make a ship this big and this insane, you need to have vision. A vision so wild that nobody sees it coming, and you end up revolutionizing the industry. Just like Squarespace has done with websites using artificial intelligence. Now, we've all heard how AI will change the game, but with Squarespace, it's next level. Combining AI with 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise, Squarespace has created a new AI platform to unlock your strongest creative potential. Squarespace will actually recommend a fantastic design to reach your goals and build a website for you that will craft a bespoke digital identity and not look like a template ever again. The game has changed thanks to Squarespace. But building a website with Squarespace is only the beginning, because you can also run email campaigns, you can get more customers, and even launch courses like how to build the world's largest paddle steamer. That's right, if you want to teach something, Squarespace is now your one-stop shop for your entire educational portal, and it's fantastic at running a merch store, which is where I have my merch store at www.foundandexplain.shop. So if you want to follow in my footsteps, or you want to reinvent the North Atlantic steam trade, head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to www.squarespace.com/found to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. The Eastern Steam Navigation Company, or ESN Co as I'll say from now on, had been formed in 1851 to capitalise on the booming trade to Australia, which was spurred by the gold rush, and had bid on a government mail contract, but had lost out to a rival line. So, left with capital but no project to invest it, ESN Co was receptive to Brunel's grand idea of a mega ship. So in 1854, Brunel partnered with engineer John Scott Russell to construct the hull at Millwall on the Thames. Russell, respected for his ship design work and had already built several ships with Brunel, underbid the contract at £377,000, which was actually well below Brunel's own estimate, which, if you're playing along in the audience, that's the first red flag. Unknown to Brunel, Russell was already in financial trouble. With no dry dock big enough to build the ship had to be constructed on a vast timber slipway and launched sideways, an unprecedented engineering risk and something that hadn't really been tried before. Construction would begin in May of 1854, and it would be a double hull. Now, today, a double hull is relatively common, but back then it was a new, innovative way to stop sinking ships. It was so innovative that after the SS Great Eastern, it wouldn't be used again for at least 100 years. This double hull would use over 30,000 iron plates and more than 3 million hand-driven rivets. Special rolling and punching machines had to be developed to construct this hull, increasing the cost. Two propulsion systems, the massive paddle engines with their 74-inch cylinders and a separate screw-driven engine, proposed enormous challenges. A 40-ton crankshaft failed twice before being successfully cast on the third try. This was the only thing that would be powerful and strong enough to transfer the power from the engines to the propulsion systems. You also notice that the ship has 5 smokestacks. This was for the 10 boilers and its 4 steam engines. Later on, there will only be 4 smokestacks, but spoilers, you'll see why in a minute. But what about those sails? Well, they were thought to be a great way to get the boat moving in wind, but they never actually worked. The hot smoke from the stacks interfered with the sails, setting them on fire, and they would never be used. As the project progressed, Russell started juggling multiple contracts, building 5 other boats at the same time, diverting resources and workers away from the Great Eastern to do so. And by 1856, this all came to a head when he requested an emergency £15,000 to cover wages, many for the men working on other projects. Fearing collapse, Brunel and the Eastern Steam Navigation Company decided to seize the ship and the yard and kick Russell out. Because of this, Russell's firm folded weeks later, leaving behind debts and an incomplete hull. Brunel decided to assume full control. He leased the yard, rehired skilled workers, and continued construction. And by 1857, the hull and engines were nearly ready. But the launch preparations still lagged, mainly due to the fact that Russell, during the construction, had resisted the sideways launch plan and had kept delaying it. The launch cradle hadn't even been contracted until January 1857, forcing costly delays and a lease extension as the funds ran low. But now that the ship was somewhat built, it was time to launch it to the sea. But as it was the heaviest thing ever made by humans at that point, this would be nearly impossible. Great Eastern was planned to be launched on the 3rd of November 1857 and prepared a big send-off for the 12,000-ton hull to enter the Thames and do its finishing touches. However, disaster would strike, and in front of the world's press, large crowds, a French prince, and even the ambassador to Siam, the ship would get stuck on the launch rails, crushing the steel and 2 men. Yes, unfortunately, the boat would claim another 2 victims on the day of its launch, in addition to the 5 during its construction, starting the rumours of its incredible bad luck. Newspapers dubbed the ship the Great Failure, and the critics called it Brunel's Folly. The clock was ticking, funds were nearly exhausted in the project, and the yard's owners grew impatient because it seemed like this boat was never going to be launched. Rescheduling the launch by a few more months, the company would try again, and this time using chains, jacks, hydraulic rams, they would force it into the sea. And this wouldn't be cheap, as they needed to hire nearly every system they could find in southeast England for huge sums of money. So much so that one engineer was able to start his own engineering company simply from the higher rates of his hydraulic ram. But despite the vast cost in money and human lives, it was finally out at sea. Well, kinda. The protracted construction and costly launch of the Great Eastern drained the Ayers&Co's coffers. By the time the ship was afloat in early 1858 in the Thames, the company reportedly spent around £600,000 to £700,000 on the project, nearly double John Russell's initial bid. The directors attempted additional fundraising, but many had lost faith after the launch fiasco. With the ship still incomplete, it needed to be fully fitted out with interiors, machinery and rigging, the company was in a financial crisis. It was effectively insolvent, close to bankruptcy, as one account bluntly stated. To prevent an outright bankruptcy, the decision was made to wind up the Eastern Steam Navigation Company and transfer the project to a new financial entity. Thus, in mid-1858, a fresh consortium of investors was assembled to rescue the Great Eastern. They formed a new company, pointedly named the Great Ship Company, also known as the Great Eastern Ship Company, with a capital of £340,000. In autumn of 1858, this new company purchased the Great Eastern from the failing company for £160,000. The price was a fraction of what had been spent, and it meant enormous losses for the original investors. In all, the collapse of the company meant an estimated loss of £600,000. Poetically, it seemed the gigantic ship had sunk its creators in a sea of debt before ever sailing a mile. And the second round of investors were now in charge. They solicited tenders to complete the ship's interior, get that machinery, and all of its finishing touches. And interestingly, John Scott Russell found himself back in the game, putting in a bid to finish the job that he had left. Yes, this is the same guy who failed before. Because Brunel was away on sick leave because of the stress of launching this ship, the board actually went ahead with Russell's low tender of £125,000 to fit out the ship, much to the surprise of the engineer when he came back. In January of 1859, Russell resumed work on the Great Eastern, now as a contractor to the new company, agreeing to have her ready for sea in 6 months. And by summer of 1859, the ship was finally nearing completion. The opulent passenger accommodations, grand saloons, and state cabins were fitted inside the enormous hull, with journalists marveling that each of the ship's 5 main salons was like a complete hotel dropped into the ship. Although this came at an enormous cost, the ship was now redesigned to only go from England to America rather than its original grand plan to sail to Australia. The vessel was complete, and it was time for its maiden voyage. And that's when it exploded. In September of 1859, the ship sailed from her dock towards the channel, accompanied by many spectators. However, off Hastings, she suffered a massive steam explosion caused by a valve being left shut by accident after a pressure test of the system, which would kill 5 crewmen and destroy the forwardmost funnel. And that's not only how we passed 10 deaths so far, but also how it went down to 4 smokestacks. Brunel, who had devoted the last years of his life to this project, suffered a stroke just days before this incident after seeing the ship underway, and died on the 15th of September 1859, never witnessing the Great Eastern in full service, and bumping our death toll up to 11. Despite the tragic setbacks, the ship was repaired and went on to make an initial Atlantic voyage in 1860 under the Great Ship Company's flags. Yet commercially, the Great Eastern struggled in its passenger service. Her size made her expensive to run and ill-suited for the North Atlantic route. And it's these exact mathematics that would result in the ship halving in value despite it just setting sail. The owning company was now badly in debt after the refit and found itself having to sell. This revelation forced the resignation of the board of directors, who were then replaced by a third group of controlling stockholders. So this is the third group of stockholders that now owned the ship in its lifetime in under 10 years, which is just ridiculous. This new board was determined to make a profit and thought a great way would be exhibiting it in North America as a wonder of the world. They played major cities against each other, sparking a bidding war. Portland, Maine even built a $125,000 pier backed by the Grand Trunk Railway. But in the end, New York City won by quickly dredging a berth to receive her. Remember, this ship was so big that no one could actually have her in her city, so this was a big deal. But unfortunately for the investors, the gravy train would never leave the station. Great Eastern began her maiden voyage in June of 1860 with just 35 passengers and over 400 crew. Though the crossing to New York was smooth and crowds gathered to see her arrive, public backlash began over the high entry fee and poor organization soured enthusiasm. Normally ships coming into port in New York charged 25 cents to see the inside, but these chaps were charging a whole $1, which was a lot of money back then. Because of the unpopularity, they decided to run a small route down to Virginia with many passengers on board, but this exposed major logistical flaws, from spoiled provisions to sanitation issues, duplicated tickets, and disorderly cabins. Families were getting split up and put into random cabins with complete strangers. There were also police stationed on board who were supposed to catch pickpocketers, but they were discovered by the disgruntled passengers and they turned on them, forcing them into a livestock pen for the journey in a riot. Financially, the American tour was a complete disaster. Instead of the £700,000 in projected revenue, the ship brought in only £120,000 against £72,000 in overhead. So they said, stuff America, let's go to Canada instead. And they loaded up with cargo and sailed north from New York. And boy, you thought this ship was unlucky. Upon arriving in Halifax at the lighthouse, they were given an entry toll. Now, this toll wasn't per ship or per passenger, but based on ship tonnage. And since this ship had the largest tonnage in the world, you can see where I'm going with this, the toll was $1,750. This enraged the owners, who abandoned the stop and decided to return to Britain. The 1860 trip proved to be an engineering success, but a financial failure. And once again, the ship's ownership company attempted to turn the Great Eastern profitable. But before they could, they had to do some repairs after its first year of service. They put out an open tender with an aim to not hire a specific person, but in the end, they actually did have to hire John Scott Russell for a third time. Why? Because he sued them, winning the case that his contract was still valid for the repairs, costing them not only the repairs, but also £12,000 in damages. Oh boy, this boat was starting to become very expensive. Great Eastern would sail again in 1861, contracted by the British War Office to transport over 2,000 troops to Canada leading up to the US Civil War, a successful mission that proved her strength as a massive capacity carrying beast. But soon after, the military ended the contract, much to the disappointment of the board. Later that year, the ship was also nearly destroyed in a hurricane. She lost her paddle wheels, sails, and steering and had to be towed into port. One man died, and the damages cost £300,000. While a few profitable voyages followed, they weren't enough to sustain the company. In 1862, the ship struck an uncharted rock near New York, tearing a massive hole in her outer hull. And having enough of this venture, the board of directors finally put her up to auction in 1864. Only for it to be sold to a small group of the same directors who bought her for just £125,000 and let the original company collapse, cutting out the shareholders. This is the fourth time that this ship has made people go bankrupt. This ship was then leased to Cyrus Field to lay undersea telegraph cables. She succeeded in 1866, earning stock in the cable companies and salvaging her reputation as a technological marvel. Remember, this was an engineering success, but a financial failure as a passenger transport. She would go on to lay cables around the world, including to India and the Middle East, but the opening of the Suez Canal, which she was too large to transit, diminished her utility. By the 1880s, the Great Eastern was finding itself obsolete. She was turned into a floating billboard, showboat, and a tourist attraction, but would damage at least 10 vessels during her career, including one on her final promotional voyage in 1886. So the decision was made with heavy hearts in 1888 to be sold for scrap. It would take 18 months to dismantle her double hull. Her parts were savaged and scattered, some becoming furniture and others turning into bars and school playhouses. And although a failure as a passenger ship, the Great Eastern became a legend of ambition, engineering, and costly overreach. The vessel's successful launch and completion, against all odds, expanded the frontiers of naval architecture. Her design innovations, the double hull, bulkhead compartmentation, hybrid propulsion, were ahead of its time and later became a standard feature. The story of the Great Eastern is thus one of triumph through adversity, and it highlights the intense creative partnership and rivalry of Brunel and Scott Russell, two titans of Victorian engineering. And it illustrates that extreme technological and financial challenges involved in pushing technology to its limits in the 19th century could be overcome. As difficult as the great ship proved to build, she remains an iconic feat of engineering, born from Brunel's genius and tempered by the hard lessons of experience. Oh, and if you're still watching, I completely forgot to tell you about the ghost story that's associated with this ship, but I feel like that's a complete other video that I'll be putting on my other channel. They won't tell you. The link is down in the description, so you should go check that out if you're feeling a little bit spooky.